Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thrilled to have you here with us. Welcome to Learning at Home While Underconnected, How Public Media Can Help. Please introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're calling from, and I'll encourage you also to use the Q&A function here in Zoom to submit questions for the speakers to take at the end of our session together. Okay, without further ado, I'm Michael Preston, Executive Director of the Joan Ganz Cooney Center. We're a research and innovation lab within Sesame Workshop, the nonprofit that makes Sesame Street, and named for the visionary creator of that show. We work with partners in both public and commercial media, and we build bridges between them and academics, practitioners, policymakers, and funders to help the field do a better job prioritizing and supporting kids' learning and well-being. We're thrilled today to have gathered a group of distinguished researchers and public media leaders to speak to an issue that's very important to all of us here today, digital equity for families, particularly when it comes to learning. First, we'll discuss the new Learning at Home While Underconnected report from New America, written by scholar Vikki Katz, who's here with us today, and media and policy expert Vicky Rideout, which arrives 5 years after their Cooney Center report, Opportunity for All, Technology and Learning in Lower Income Families. That earlier report documented two kinds of gaps: an access gap, which we typically think of as a digital divide, and a participation gap where digital resources are not well supported for children's progress. That report also documented the many creative ways families mobilize to support their children and strengthen family bonds. The new report we're talking about today presents findings from research conducted in the spring, 1 full year into our pandemic, and a time that felt like it might be the light at the end of the tunnel. However, we're not so sure that that's happening yet, but we'll see. But consistent with that earlier report, I think we can expect Vikki to share some of the myriad ways that families leaned into their children's learning and built connections with teachers. Also with us today is Lisa Guernsey, she and her team at New America published this report and conducted in-depth focus group interviews in 3 communities, and she'll share some of these stories with us today. We'll then turn to members from the public media community, whom I'll introduce a little later in the program. You may know the Cooney Center is partnering with CPB to support media creation by, with, and for young people. CPB's own Deb Sanchez spoke at our 2014 Learning at Home event. So to conclude my segment, this research is a vital contribution to the field. We thank Vikki Katz, Vicky Rideout, and Michael Levine from Noggin for their commitment to elevating the voices of lower income families and ensuring that practitioners, policymakers are armed with the knowledge they need to address these critical equity issues. Okay, so one more time. Introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already, and please use the Q&A function to submit questions. Okay, without further ado, let's turn it over to Vikki Katz. She's an associate professor of communications at the Rutgers School of Communications and Information. She conducts research on how working class, low income, and immigrant children and their families adopt and integrate technology into family routines and learning. She also focuses on how families respond to policy initiatives to reduce digital inequality, and how immigrant families interact with US social institutions that shape how they integrate into their adopted communities. And she's also co-editor of the Journal of Children and Media and associate editor for AERA Open. Briefly, let me also introduce Lisa so they can just talk back to back. Lisa's senior fellow and strategic advisor in the education policy program at New America. Her writing sits at the intersection of literacy, including digital and media literacy, equity in education systems, including libraries, schools, and digital environments, and the science of learning. At New America, she's led teaching, learning, and tech team, directed the early education initiative, and co-founded and co-leads the Learning Sciences Exchange, among numerous other things. So now, without further ado, once more, I give you Vikki Katz. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And let me start by thanking Michael Preston and Catherine G for organizing and hosting this wonderful event. It's great to be back at the Cooney Center, even if it's virtually, and really very appropriate because this is where this work started with Opportunity for All, which we did in 2015 and 2016 in partnership with Michael Levine, Lori Takeuchi, and the Cooney Center staff, and of course, my co-author, the other part of the Vikki team, Vicky Rideout. While digital inequality and how it impacts learning has become the center of a national conversation in the last year and a half, Opportunity for All shows that this has been an issue for a long time. Today, I'm going to share findings from our new report, Learning at Home While Underconnected, which was published by New America in the summer of this year. In March and April of 2021, Vikki Rideout and I led a national telephone survey of more than 1,000 lower-income families with school-age children and preschool-age children about their technology and learning experiences in the first year of the pandemic. There were a lot of studies of families during the pandemic, so let me just summarize quickly what makes this one different. We conducted a full year into the pandemic, so we could ask families to look back on a whole year. And as Michael Preston pointed out, at that point, feeling optimistic about the beginning of the fall, asked them to look forward to what they were hoping for in a return to something that felt more normal. But what makes this study really different is a few things. First of all, we focused on families raising children below the US median income for their demographic, which is $75,000 a year. That's important for two reasons. First of all, digital inequality disproportionately affects lower income families. And so understanding these families on their own terms rather than in comparison to families with far more socioeconomic privilege is important. It also meant that we had subsample sizes that were large enough to do meaningful comparisons. It's a probability-based survey, and it's a telephone survey. We didn't do this online, which is how most of the surveys of families during the pandemic were conducted. We think that's really important because if you're asking people about unequal access and challenges with connecting with technology, using those technologies to collect data poses a lot of challenges and problems. And finally, because this is a follow-up to Opportunity for All, which we conducted the data collection for in 2015, we can track changes over time, which means that we have the luxury of looking at the pandemic in broader context instead of looking at it by itself. Next slide, please. Let me start also by saying that this work would not have been possible without the generous support of a consortium of funders who are all willing to move quickly to study crucial challenges for families right as they were unfolding. And we're deeply grateful to all of them, to Noggin, to the Overdeck Family Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Grable Foundation, and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I'm also deeply grateful to Lisa Guernsey and New America for their partnership in this work. I want to just overview three key findings. It's a long report, there's a lot in there. But to start our conversation about public media's crucial role in helping families with young children through and out of the pandemic. The first relates to digital inequality. We found that less families are unconnected to the internet and digital devices than in 2015, but that millions remain underconnected. I'm going to briefly talk about the difference between these groups and what that distinction means for public media. Second, that educational media, including PBS content, has been crucial for families to keep their kids learning and growing during the pandemic. I'm going to talk about parents' priorities for their children's learning as well as we begin emerging from the pandemic and how public media can help meet those needs. And finally, that families engage technology as digital learning teams. Public media has always thought of families as collaborative learning partners for each other, and our findings reinforce those choices and offer some new insights. Next slide, please. So let's start with some good news. Because we were able to track changes in families' digital connectivity between 2015 and 2021, we found large increases in home broadband access in particular. As you can see here, 84% of lower income families with school-age children have broadband access in 2021, a 20 percentage point increase from 2015 if you compare the teal and pink bars on the far left of your screen. If you look across, you'll see that the gains are even greater for families raising children below the federal poverty level, for Black families, and families headed by US-born Hispanics. For families headed by immigrant Hispanic parents, we see the largest increases of all. 35% reported having home broadband access in 2015, and 75% have it now. And home computer access is up to 91% in 2021, compared with 82% in 2015. That's good news. It also means that a considerable number of families remain unconnected a full year into a pandemic that required remote learning in whole or part. 1 in 7 families still lack broadband access at home, and 1 in 8 don't have a computer at home. Those proportions are higher in families living below the poverty level, families headed by immigrant parents, and those who have not completed high school. In looking at all the good news we see on the screen, let's be mindful of who is still being fully left out. There's also a much more complicated reality hidden within these numbers. Millions of families are what we are calling underconnected, meaning that the digital access they do have is too inadequate or inconsistent to meet their needs. Next slide, please. So this graph compares lower-income families' experiences of being underconnected, and the two colors compare those living above and below the federal poverty line. You'll see that we looked at a number of challenges related to being underconnected. For example, we find that among lower-income families who say, yes, we have a computer at home. Click forward, please, Ryan. 6 in 10 said it was too slow or didn't work properly, and almost 1 in 4 said it was hard to get enough time on their shared device to do the things that they needed to. Next. Among families who said yes, we have broadband, almost 6 in 10 say their service is too slow, and 1 in 5 have had their service cut off for at least once in the past year because they couldn't pay for it. And finally, 1 in 3 who depend on a mobile device to access the internet, which we consider a form of being underconnected in and of itself, especially when you're trying to work or go to school. You can see that about 1 in 3 say that they've reached the data limit on their mobile plan, that there's too many people sharing the mobile device to get the time they need on it, or that their cell phone service has been cut off due to cost, which is very concerning considering that a lot of families depend on a cell phone as their only phone. And so what you see here is that this is what it means to be underconnected, that you can say, yes, I have internet, yes, I have a computer, but that the quality and consistency of that, the device and the connection are not what you need to do the things you need to do. And these data show just how crucial it is for public media and other groups to ask more than yes, no questions about broadband and devices. So many families who would answer yes to an access question nonetheless suffer challenges of being underconnected. And while we need to be working to resolve those challenges, we also need to be designing content for families that accounts for the realities of what it means to be underconnected. Next slide. The second key finding for our discussion today relates to how much families relied on educational TV shows or online videos, played educational games, or did creative activities like making art or music on their digital devices. More than 7 in 10 surveyed parents said that their children were using these kinds of educational media during the pandemic, and about 1 in 3 said they used them often. More than 9 in 10 parents whose children used educational media said that these learning resources had helped them keep their kids learning and growing during the pandemic. Educational media were most important to children in the lowest income families. For example, 41% of children in households with incomes below the federal poverty line often watched educational videos online, compared with 29% of children who were growing up in lower income families, but with incomes above the federal poverty line. We also asked parents of 6 to 13-year-olds whether their children had watched TV shows or videos that had helped them explain the coronavirus pandemic to their children. 40% said that they had, and most had found that content helpful, as you can see in this quote from a grandmother who participated in our Pittsburgh focus groups. Furthermore, Black and Hispanic children and children whose family incomes were below the federal poverty level are more likely to have watched pandemic-related educational programming and to have found it helpful than white parents and parents whose incomes are above the federal poverty level. Taken together, these findings suggest that educational media were important to keeping kids in lower income families learning and growing this year and explaining the pandemic to them. And that these media were especially important to supporting families who are the most likely to be underconnected, those with the lowest incomes and families of color. Next slide. Looking forward, we asked parents, after all the educational disruptions the pandemic has caused this last year, what do you think will be most important for your child at school this fall? We gave them 5 possible priorities and the option to answer the question in their own words. The priorities we provided, 2 were academic, 1 was physical, and 2 were socio-emotional. The majority of parents selected socio-emotional priorities as most important, as you can see here. For parents whose children will have entered preschool or kindergarten in fall of 2021, 6 in 10 selected either selecting time with other kids or learning how to manage and express their emotions as their most important priority for this school year, compared with just 1/3 who selected starting to learn how to read or learning their numbers. And among parents whose children were entering 1st grade or higher, half chose either social and emotional well-being or spending time with other kids as their top priority, again, compared with 1/3 who chose an academic priority like reading and writing or math and science. The remainder of both chose physical activity as most important. Now, those findings don't imply that academics are not important to parents. Reading was the number 2 priority for parents in both age groups, but it does show how deeply concerned parents are about their children's socialization after more than a year of remote learning and social distancing. And given how important educational media have been for families during this past year, media content that stresses socio-emotional well-being is likely to resonate very strongly with parents' present priorities going forward. Last slide. Finally, we examined how parents, children, and siblings rely on each other to learn about and with technology. We asked the same questions in our 2015 survey and found that family members frequently relied on each other as technology learning partners. Parents guide children, children guide parents, and siblings guide each other at very high rates. Who guides who the most within a family varies by parents' education level, by race and ethnicity, and by immigrant generation and children's ages, since parents rely more on their older children. These patterns persisted in 2021, but we found that parents and children were helping each other to learn with technology even more in 2021 than they were in 2015. For example, we found that more than half, 55% of parents with 10 to 13-year-olds help their kids with technology as much as they rely on their children's help. Those kinds of fluid exchanges of who's the expert and who's the learner are powerful opportunities for both generations to develop tech-related skills and confidence. And siblings are also helping each other learn about computers and digital devices more in 2021 than they were in 2015, suggesting that content that encourages family collaboration will continue to be a very good bet. I promised I was going to do this in 10 minutes. I think I've achieved that goal, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the implications of the findings for public media's work ahead. But before we get there, it is my delight to introduce Lisa Guernsey, Senior Fellow and Strategic Advisor in the Education Policy Program at New America, and my brilliant collaborator and co-conspirator for this project. Lisa.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Vikki. Big thanks to the Cooney Center for hosting this event. And just want to say what a real pleasure it has been to work on this with Vikki and Vikki Rideout, as well as Michael Levine. We really were excited to put this together, and I'm really glad it's now we're able to really focus in on what this means for public media, because as we heard in Vikki's comments, this is really kind of key, that these are resources that are so important to families. And you are here to make that happen for them. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of another part of the Learning at Home While Underconnected project. We did community discussion groups to go along with this project so that we could go more in depth. You saw some quotations that were coming from those. We feel like this really helps us to understand better what families are going through. We did these discussion groups in 3 areas: in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Santa Clara County, California, with parents or grandparents of those who parents or grandparents raising children ages 3 to 6, but many of them were also raising other kids of other ages too. So you really see quite a range in the responses. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to note how we were able to make these community discussion groups happen. We partnered with Raising a Reader, which was really key to this project, and they're a national organization and they have local affiliates, and those local affiliates for this project were Brilliant Detroit, Reading Ready Pittsburgh, Grail Family Services, and First 5 Santa Clara County, which enabled us to then connect with the families that were served by these organizations. That also made sure that we were talking to families that matched the same demographics that Vikki and Vikki Rideout's survey did. These were mostly lower income families that were being served by these organizations. And we did the focus groups, or the discussion groups as we call them, in both English and Spanish. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the research and writing of the community briefs was done by Laura Zimmerman of Tech Play Collaborative. And I just want to shout out a big thanks to Laura for her work on this. She may even be here in the audience. I know she's going to try to be joining us today as well. It made a huge difference to have Laura doing so much of the work with the local affiliates on this project. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to quickly just take you through how we did the community discussions. These were conducted at the same time as the large national survey in April of 2021, again with households that were in the income level below the US median. Before we brought everyone together for the discussions, we did a brief online survey with them, and we were able to collect some survey data that I'll show you in a moment that also helped us better understand what these families were coping with, especially when it came to their ability to connect online. We we're not able to do these in person because of the pandemic. So this is one case where, and we weren't doing them on the phone either. So this is one case where a big caveat is these were families that were able to connect via Zoom, at least through their phones. In many cases, that was how they connected with us. And we did altogether discussions with 24 parents and grandparents. So 9 in Pittsburgh, 11 in Detroit, and 14 in Santa Clara County. So if you go to the next slide, I want to just quickly note where you can find all of this material before I go into some of the results from it. As Vikki mentioned, this is all a material that was published as partnership with Rutgers and New America. So on the New America website, on our Education Policy Programs website, you can find our collection of all of these different reports, the community briefs, as well as video from the event that we did back in June to launch the report. And then we also just last month published a toolkit for communities, and this could also be used by public media stations, as was noted earlier before we were getting started. We're talking about how it could be incredibly useful to those who are working in local communities to perhaps use some of the question sets. So all of those are open source and available to you. And I'll put that in the chat in a moment where you can find all this. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see, I just want to call out a couple of things that we found from these community discussion groups. One is that community support is just vital. The connection to a community-based organization made a huge difference for these families. So you see the quote here on this slide. This is from one of our parent participants in Detroit. For me, it was Brilliant Detroit and Southwest Solutions that had a program called Kids Mental Health, where they give materials for the kids. The students' teachers also helped me a lot. We heard over and over again how much those local connections mattered. If you go to the next slide, you'll see another thing that was a recurring theme, and that is that media, children's media, was really helping kids to cope and continues to in what we're seeing anecdotally. So this is an example from a Santa Clara County parent. I recognize this is not necessarily from a public media show, but one I think just does capture kind of what was happening for parents. There was a quote here that's from a mother of a 6-year-old girl. I think there was even a DuckTales episode, she said, that recently, where they were wearing masks. And, you know, I think that just made it more like the norm. So just an example of how this media matters so much to our families. Now, if you go to the next slide, I just want to quickly show you some of the data that came through the online surveys that we did before we brought everyone together for the discussions. So here you see Santa Clara County, and it's probably a bit hard to read. I'll just quickly note that the top data point is that 12 of our participants, 12 of the 14, noted that their computer was running too slowly or didn't even work properly enough for them to really do the kind of learning that they wanted to with their young children. This internet service was too slow for 10 of those families. Next slide. This one shows you that in Detroit, it was similar challenges. Again, at the very top was the computer running too slowly, but also that it was so hard to share devices across all the different family members. It was hard to get enough time, and that the internet service was too slow to really do what they wanted to do. That came through for 4 of the 11 in Detroit. And then lastly, this shows Santa Clara County. We can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, shows Pittsburgh, the next slide. And again, they were having trouble with their devices and the computers and slow internet access. And I also just want to note here that 3 of the 9 in Pittsburgh, so a considerable chunk, 30%, were having their internet service cut off because it was too expensive and it was difficult to pay for it. So those are just some of the things that you can learn from doing this kind of research with the families in your communities, and that I think really inform what digital inequality means far beyond just simple questions of like, do you have internet access or do you not? I think Vikki and Vikki's work has really shown how much more nuance and complex information there is and what it really means to be underconnected. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to take us to the next part of the event. So thanks again, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Vikki and Lisa, for bringing us through the highlights of the report. Obviously, there's so much more to be read. I'll also note that a few folks have already asked questions, and Vikki has been bravely going in and answering them in real time. So please continue to send your questions there, and we'll come back at the end to discuss. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and bring our public media leaders forward to share some of their strategies and lessons learned from the pandemic. As all of us on this call are familiar with the myriad ways in which public media stepped up to meet the challenges of the pandemic in the last 18 months. And so it's our pleasure to bring them here together. So first up, we have Deb Sanchez. She's the Senior Vice President for Educational Media and Learning Experience at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, also our partner in the Youth Initiative. She develops and oversees children's content investments and educational initiatives at the national level, and also works closely with stations to enhance their development and execution of local education initiatives. I mentioned that she spoke at our 2014 Learning at Home event, and at that time, our conversation was focused on the drop-off of kids' consumption of educational media after age 4, which was partly attributed to the rise of mobile devices, but parents still viewed TV more favorably because of what PBS offered them. So, and that's a theme we continue to hear from even the young people, the big kids that we're speaking to for our other project. So I'm sure we'll hear more of that today. So without further ado, again, I give you Deb Sanchez.
Thanks, Michael. You know, when you referenced the 2014 event, the time when I left Washington, it was a snow day, and we were traveling up to New York for this event. And part of my discussion at that point were, how do we help kids during a snow day? And how are we more reactive and responsive to those short-term school closures? And little did we know that we would be experiencing such a significant school closure period of time, or in-person school closure, and switch to virtual, and not too short after that event. So I just had a quick memory of that, that event at that time. But we all know that in March 2020, huge disruptions for kids, for families, for teachers, for parents, everybody disrupted by the pandemic. And our public media community really reacted very quickly. And they were really able to do so because they were deeply connected within their local community and with the needs of their local communities. And when we talk about community, we don't just talk about people who live in a city or a region or a neighborhood. We think about communities a little differently, and we think about different types of communities: a parent community, an educator community, a community of people who think about workforce challenges and needs that young people might face. So we think about the distinct needs of different communities that we serve locally, regionally, and nationally. And stations consider all of these needs as they develop educational media, and they think about the learning experience people are going to have with that media. But we wanted to look at, as a result of the pandemic and knowing we were deeply invested in education and public media for a very long time, it's our mission. We wanted to get a deeper look at what was changing in response to the pandemic. We knew that stations were quickly turning over their broadcast time for educational purposes so that their channels became gateways for educational content. But we wanted to look at what was actually happening within the station level and how is that changing their workflow. So in the summer of 2020, we surveyed our station community across the US. This is both radio and television. And we asked some specific questions about the types of partnerships they were having at the community level and what was happening with their work at the station. More than half of the stations that we surveyed said they developed a new partnership with a local or state education agency. So we found that school districts and state departments of education were contacting stations directly. You'll hear from some of my colleagues in a moment who can talk about those experiences from their perspective. But we saw the rise in those types of partnerships significantly during the pandemic. We also know that more than half the stations worked more closely with educators to develop, to inform, and to vet content. And in some cases, they worked with educators to provide direct instruction over broadcast and digital channels. Now, while broadcast was critical, stations used every media platform at their disposal, including PBS Learning Media, which is our national resource for our national content that becomes part of a service that teachers use in the classroom to help supplement instruction, using all of our treasured public media content to help with learning needs. We use social media and podcasting to respond to all of the learning challenges that communities were facing. And also we saw shifts in how stations were allocating their own internal resources for staff. So a number of stations increased positions for education specifically. So they looked at either additional hires or redirecting staff needs to meet the demand that they were seeing from the education parent and school communities. Now in the pre-K space, we did some needs assessment research conducted as part of a U.S. Department of Education Ready to Learn grant that we manage with PBS. So CPP and PBS manage this grant. And we are learning about the persistent challenges facing families. And I'll tell you, these challenges aren't new. I think we're just seeing them more pervasive right now. We're looking at the needs around finding adequate childcare, feelings of isolation with adults caring for children, and how those feelings were made worse during the pandemic. So that the problems were there prior to the pandemic, but became more increased or heightened by the pandemic. And we also know that parents are eager to support their children's learning and want to participate, excuse me, in any trainings and workshops that we would offer, but they needed a couple of things in order to do that. They needed reliable childcare, and they needed materials in languages other than English, particularly in Spanish. So as more children get to back to in person, as we're seeing this fall, many stations are now turning their attention to these kinds of persistent issues, which includes learning loss. And for older kids, changes in how they're looking at what their future looks like. What does it mean for them to pursue post-secondary education? What does training look like as they prepare for the future of work? So those are some efforts that our stations are now taking a look at. But we also, we know that overwhelmingly, we will always think about our local communities, the needs of those communities, and be responsive to those needs. And I feel really fortunate to be in this industry, working in public media, because I think at the heart of our work, we care about the families and the kids and the educators and our community. So this work, I think our response during the pandemic was certainly illustrative of that commitment. So with that, I will turn it back over to Michael.
Deb, thank you so much. Thanks for highlighting all the different ways that communities came together and public media stations really strengthened or initiated partnerships with their local public school systems as well. I think that's just a fantastic story in general. And now a good time to transition to Georgeann Herbert, who's the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Engagement at Detroit Public Television, where she develops strategies and business plans based on building strong relationships with partners and community groups. She also oversees all of the education initiatives at DPTV, including direct services to families and teachers in the city of Detroit, and the production and engagement of the Michigan Learning Channel across Michigan, as well as the development of PBS Books as a national platform. So without further ado, Georgeann.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Michael. I keep going back to that moment on Friday, the 13th of March, 2020, when the shutdown started, particularly in Michigan, and thinking that this was going to be a short-term thing. And it's taken us on a journey that I think, as Deb mentioned, the relationships we have in our community turned out to be incredibly important. And so that by Monday, the following Monday, we were taking advantage of all the PBS resources at our disposal to publish a daily newsletter out to parents with learning activities to keep them engaged and pointing to opportunities on the channels that were available. And it went from infants and toddlers all the way through K-12. We also, on that 16th of March, that Monday, convened for the first time a daily conversation that we had every day at noon with 25 to 30 educators from partnerships that we had across the region. And we were getting early real-time data on some of the things that Vikki has outlined in the study around the inadequacy of internet for many families, the lack of technical knowledge, the community really rallied and did some heroic things to try to put devices into the hands of every child. But there wasn't always the technical knowledge at home for families to use that technology as effectively as possible. As the circle grew, we began to talk to a lot of statewide educators and had conversations with the Michigan Department of Education and many of the professional organizations of educators around the state. And it was really clear that this was a problem that wasn't just unique to Detroit. This was a statewide problem, and particularly acute in rural areas of Michigan, as well as in urban areas, where in many rural areas, there just isn't really a broadband option. And the numbers range anywhere from 30 to 60% of students in the Michigan public schools were not able to access internet in a way that let them support learning. And so out of that, that's when the concept of the Michigan Learning Channel was born. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Ryan. We managed to pull together for the first time all 6 public television stations in Michigan to work on a single project. And with funding that we received from the state legislature and from the governor's office, it was the first public funding that public television has received in Michigan in at least 30 years to support the creation of the Michigan Learning Channel. So this gives you a sense of the geography, because the stations cover the state really, really well, reaching at least 98% of the families in the state with over-the-air coverage. Into the next slide, please. The Michigan Learning Channel ended up launching in January of this year after running a pilot in November of last year. We were able to get the pilot up and running locally within 30 days of confirming state funding. But we launched statewide in January. We are very focused on K-3 at the beginning, because that's where the education community told us they needed us to be. We have been producing in collaboration with educators our English language arts program, Read, Write, Roar, as well as Math Mites, which we're getting great feedback on both of those programs. The lady in the corner with the blue shirt is a reflection of the social emotional content that we launched with, and we continue to expand. And over the summer, we were able to add extra credit, which is a program that's geared toward grades 4 to 6. And it really features youth voice. And it's now turning into a professional development program for high school students, as we're taking it around the state to be able to let students be the actual host of the program, talking to other students. Next slide, please. One of the things that we find about our work, and one of the things we were able to do with the state funding, is to provide grants to each of the stations in the state, many of whom did not have an active education department. Only a couple of them did. So they have used those funds to hire engagement coordinators at each of the stations, whose primary job is to go out and make contact with families and with teachers, and to show them the Michigan Learning Channel and how to keep it going. And we had a very active campaign over the summer. That's when all the engagement coordinators were finally in place, where we distributed over 30,000 activity guides tied to the programming on the channel. They were distributed statewide through the Michigan Department of Education summer feeding program, as well as about 10,000 copies just within the city of Detroit itself. And right now we are in the middle, next slide, please. We are in the middle of a literacy campaign. We actually have a literacy challenge out to the entire state right now to read or have children read to for 1,000 minutes between October 1st and November 30th. And we've gotten really great take up on that from teachers around the state. And at the same time, we have launched a professional learning series to support literacy with teachers, again, with our partners at MAISA, the State Intermediate School District Association. They are where the literacy coaches live, and they have been producing a really phenomenally successful professional development program in literacy education. We continue to develop. We run a lot of PBS content for grades 6 to 12. Next slide, please. And we are looking at, how to grow out, how to do things. Next December, we're going to be focused on coding and computer and digital skills with the Week of Code, working with the Michigan STEM Network. We are in conversations around the future of work as a key component of the content that we provide to upper grade students so that they can explore careers that are available to them within Michigan and what they need to do to get there, as well as Digital Divas, which is a program that we are talking to right now about trying to create a way to bring after school activities, those extracurricular things that are so important to learning, to kids by using a broadcast platform. And finally, we have the performance, next slide, of the Michigan Learning Channel has exceeded our expectations. We thought we'd be lucky to get 100,000 viewers in the first year. We're getting 500,000 viewers a month right now statewide. And while the map that's on this slide indicates the IP addresses of people who are addressing the website, you can see we've got pretty strong coverage across the state of Michigan, as well as in the UP of Michigan. And we are picking up viewers from all across the country as well. So it's, I can just say that at the end of the day, it's about building on relationships, going into partnership. There's a whole lot of working directly with educators to say, what do teachers need? What are teachers telling us they need? What are parents telling us they need? And at the center of it goes back to a philosophy we've had ever since the early childhood work that we started with, which is how can we use PBS assets to be able to form stronger partnerships between parents and educators, using the word parents broadly, parents and educators. How do we form that partnership so that it benefits a child the most we can? And that's our story. Michael?
Thanks so much, Georgeann. That's such an inspiring story, and really kudos to you and your team for stepping up and accomplishing so much across Michigan. Wonderful. So let's now pass the baton to Jami Myers, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the Public Media Group of Southern California, which is the combined entity of PBS SoCal, KCET, and Link TV. She drives operations to ensure alignment across all aspects of her organization. Previously, when it was just PBS SoCal, though, she built programs that continue to close the gap in school readiness for young children, empowering families to fully integrate themselves into their children's learning, and spearheaded the organization's response to the COVID-19 pandemic with at-home learning, which was adapted for local use by more than 100 PBS stations nationally in more than 40 states. I turn over to Jami.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for having me today. Like Georgeann, I think I have moments where I look back to March of 2020, and I don't so much fondly remember March 13th. I remember a week before where then Superintendent Austin Buettner called us on a Sunday and pretty much asked us to come in and have a brainstorm at 8 a.m. on Monday morning, a week before any of us knew kind of what was going to happen. And at that time, next slide, we put together what then came to be known as at-home learning. And it was a broadcast schedule aligned by hour to curriculum resources in PBS Learning Media that you heard Deb talk about, and very similarly to what the Michigan Learning Channel has so successfully become. This was a moment in time where we could look at a lot of the research that's still prevalent today around accessibility and whether or not, at the time, none of us really thought that I think this work was actually going to happen, if that makes sense, while it was building for that first week. The service was aligned and extended more deeply in the community through webinars and workshops and work with parents and teachers. But the most exciting part of it, I think, was that it happened so fast. In a week, we were able to get in a room with all the curriculum heads of LAUSD and bring together, as Georgeann said, assets that were already created from public media and align them to meet the need in that moment. The service, next slide, expanded over the spring of 2020, and that broadcast schedule, similar to Georgeann, was the first time in a long time that all 14 public media stations in California came together and were all doing coordinated work to serve families and educators and children around the state. There was deep conversations that then began with the California Department of Education that hadn't, as Deb alluded to earlier, hadn't been happening before, and more conversations happening similarly around rural schools and partnerships and where we could be more deeply in the community. Similar to what what Georgeann shared, partnerships had already been built by so many of the local stations, and we were able to leverage them quickly to respond. We did have success in the sense that at the moment we had been a week ahead of, maybe not successfully, a week ahead of the rest of the country in California, and maybe knowing that the shutdown would happen. And we were able to then share these resources freely where other stations could pick up and localize it. And that's really one of the most important things I think that happened across the country, was that stations were able to look and see what their schools needed, what their families needed, and adjust and find ways to serve them with the need. Next slide. Last summer, we took a pause from at-home learning in the sense that that curriculum broadcast was made for K through 12. And we thought a lot about what our audience really needed. And we went back and we focused, and we thought about the work that was core to our work was really more in the 2 to 8 space. It was primarily bilingual, and it was primarily geared towards supporting Latino families across Southern California. We shifted at-home learning in the 2020-2021 school year to be very K-3 focused. There was still a broadcast component. There was still a direct service component in the sense that backpacks and schedules, and frankly, sometimes even content put on flash drives was taken out to families to ensure they had that educational media that they may not have been able to successfully access at that point in time. There was deep work happening in family engagement and deep work happening in educator engagement, both virtual experiences as well as digital content creation. But the most interesting thing that happened last summer for us was that we extended on this idea that once we focused, we could really listen to the community. So we've drawn on the principles of co-design in a number of projects that we've taken forward. And I think that that's what's come out of the pandemic for us, an interesting way, similar to the research that you're hearing, for us to move forward, listening to what families need and drawing on what we have to respond. So there's a couple examples here of how we've been doing that work. In partnership with the Stanford Early Learning Lab, we did a deep dive in Compton around designing a family math curriculum. Family Math is a multi-platform initiative that facilitates children's math knowledge, math interest, and math positivity by deeply supporting families in the community and at home. That work in co-design was extended from curriculum into video content creation, where families were involved in the process of creating that video content, and then extended further this year into an example where we were doing the needs assessment that Deb spoke about in the East LA community, where families came together to actually co-design what they thought a neighborhood would look like. Next slide. In Compton, we gave families a seat at the table. We brought together more than 25 parents who were mostly Hispanic, Latino, and bilingual Spanish speakers. The parents actually sat down and tested and co-designed activities. This was obviously, I think it was 2 weeks before the pandemic that the work actually happened in Compton, and then the report was released during the pandemic. Parents shared insight on how the content could have a place in their homes, and they also shared more insight on the challenge that they would face accessing that content, and that was 18 months ago. Next slide. We looked deeply at how then that could be extended into video content and connected with parents around extending that curriculum that was built into the videos and the educational media that was brought together with parents. We looked at what kind of languages they would need, what kind of voiceover they would need, what kind of strategies they would need to learn in that video content. This summer, next slide, our Learning Neighborhood also brought that together. And what we've been learning through the pandemic is from parents that when they were able to co-design content with us, they felt more confident in helping their child because they had been part of the process. They felt more prepared to have conversations. They thought that videos were simple and effective when they knew that they had actually seen themselves in the video or seen the communities that they live in the videos. And parents said that the activities needed to be easy to do at home with materials they already had. Next slide. As we think about the next 18 months, I think partnerships are a really big key to where we're headed as an organization. We're looking to expand this family math work and also dive into areas like literacy and social emotional development, which I was happy to see Vikki share that those are the bigger pieces that we're hearing from families. We're hearing the same thing on the ground with our team that's out actually speaking to families all the time. And as we think about where we go forward as an organization, while we know that we believe that things are going to continue to change and we need to continue to change with what the needs of families are, we're grounding ourselves in some core principles, and we can share those with you today. We're really listening to families' voices, their routines, and their culture. We're ensuring ease and accessibility of content. Obviously, that connects a lot with the study that was shared today, that if we're looking at the underconnected, how can we connect the underconnected, and what do they need differently than those that are connected? And then we're establishing a continuous cycle of feedback, assessment, and evaluation, because we can take the great content we have from public media, but then we need to adjust it and make it work for what a family needs today. Thank you.
Jami, thank you so much. Really inspiring story. I love how you brought in the participatory methods for working with local families and really creating a feedback cycle that I think is so valuable. So that's the conclusion of our formal presentation, and we have a few minutes left for some Q&A. Folks who have already put questions into the Q&A tool here in Zoom have gotten most of those questions answered already. Jami, I see there's one for you here as well. Maybe I'll just lead off though with a question that I have. I'd like to pose this to the whole group. I'm hearing two kind of interrelated and connected threads among what everyone has said here today. One is the collaboration among family members and the sharing of expertise that was highlighted in the Learning at Home report. You know, at Sesame, we're always interested in co-viewing and joint media engagement and other forms of collaboration among family members. And then the second is, for the public media partners on the call, the rise of new partnerships, initiative taking among the stations with their local communities, schools, school districts. In many ways, we're redefining needs collaboratively and taking action together. So these are both just sort of two sides of one coin for me, and calling them silver linings seems to discount what's really kind of impressive and worth nurturing and growing. So I wondered if folks had ideas about how we take this and grow them, nurture them, make them adopted more widely.
Well, I think the key becomes relevance. And, you know, one of the things that we get the question a lot about, you know, when COVID's over, will the Michigan Learning Channel still be there? And I think education's redefining itself in the aftermath, I think, of the COVID pandemic. And so what we see is this opportunity to continue serving families and really trying to drive family engagement in education by providing supplemental learning opportunities so that a teacher can use the channel when a child needs to catch up with his peers in the class, or, you know, that a child who's sick, or that snow day that Deb Sanchez talked about. Those are all opportunities that I think we're still exploring and think there's a lot of opportunity there to maintain relevance and engagement.
I'll just note, coming from a kind of the education policy point of view and seeing some of the more recent stories and crises related to teacher shortages and burnout, I think there's an opportunity in that to recognize that teachers shouldn't be doing it all. They can't do it all. They need support from their communities, and that public media can be a key part of that support, providing like really rich, engaging, high quality content and avenues for learning within families, so that it doesn't have to be just all on the backs of teachers today, who are just, I mean, they're still dealing with so much. I just got a message from one of our Pittsburgh parents just a couple of days ago about how the school's totally overwhelmed. They've had to shut down for the second time. They hadn't actually been able to pass out all the tablets in time, so they haven't been able to go back to virtual learning the way that they thought they could. They're trying to get worksheets back out to families, like in all sorts of different ways, because they're closing the school for the entire week. And it's just like, it's heartbreaking. But if there were more these incredible partnerships we're hearing about here, I'm just so thrilled. This Southern California and the Detroit examples are just brilliant. If we can continue to build on examples like that, then the teachers and the schools don't have to do it all by themselves.
I'll just share really briefly the other interesting opportunity that I think we're seeing even in this school year directly is families that chose to stay home or transition away from sort of choosing to go back in person. And we're seeing in California this large trend of families that opted into basically like not what they thought was going to be sort of the option of Zoom, right? So they chose independent study, and independent study isn't what they experienced basically during the pandemic. And so how we're supporting families and educators who maybe selected this option for the school year, but thought it would be like last year, and independent study specifically in California isn't structured that way. So it's been really interesting to support families again on access and on the resources who specifically kind of are maybe not as informed in what the experience would be like for the school year.
And I'll just add that I think, you know, our examples today are powerful examples of stations that stepped up to meet some real significant needs in the community. And we're continuing to see stations across the country take advantage of serving their communities in much similar ways, but really looking at the needs of who the parents are, who the teachers are, who's the audience, and what are the needs of that audience. So I think we saw an increase in our use of materials, and then with the increase comes the desire to do more. And I think stations are looking to really, up the game for their service, and really think about what is it that we can provide that's unique to our community, but also that's of benefit in sharing with our with our colleagues across the country. And that's the benefit of public media, is that there's such a rich collaboration, not only with partners within a community, but within partners across our system. So there's a real desire to share learning and to share what we know works and what didn't work. So we're seeing at our national perch real increase in this type of service, which is heartening. And our challenge is how we help sustain and support it, and make sure that it gets the attention that I think it deserves. It's really, when people hear these stories for the first time of this work, it's initially kind of surprise, like, wow, you guys did that. And really the relationships that a lot of these stations have been in existence for years and years, and they just were able to tap into those relationships and make them even stronger and deeper. So I think more to come. I would say more to come, and research like we heard today will only strengthen and help the work that we're going to continue to do.
I just wanted to add one part of the research that I didn't cover today in the interest of time, was that we asked parents to think back a year and how they've learned through the process of having to guide their children's learning at home. And we saw real gains in how much they feel they understand their children's strengths and weaknesses as a learner, whether or not they feel that they can communicate more easily with their children's teachers, whether they feel like they know more about what their children are learning, and related sorts of strengths that have grown out of necessity as having to be this very active partner as kids have been learning at home. And so I think, to piggyback on what Lisa said about how teachers are, at the end of frayed ropes and what can be done going forward, the assets that have been built in families born out of necessity, I think have created a lot of opportunities for engagement and confidence. And we saw bigger learning gains from parents raising kids below the federal poverty level, parents who have less education, and parents of color. The families that we know have historically had a harder time feeling like they can be confidently engaged with teachers and at school. So there's opportunities, I think, to build on what had to be developed as we kind of think about what comes next.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're almost out of time, and there were a lot of really good questions in the Q&A, many of which answered in real time. One thing I wanted to do, though, was call out also something I think Lisa mentioned, which is that the report, associated briefs, and other reports included a toolkit for local groups who want to do this kind of discussion work with their local communities. And I think that's a real strength of this work, that perhaps different groups that weren't represented enough, or where you feel it would be an active way to create better bonds with your community and learn more together, it's really a wonderful resource. So thank you very much for that. We're at 1 o'clock. So it's time, unfortunately, to say goodbye. I would love to just thank all of our participants and for sharing your amazing work with all of us. Vikki and Lisa for the research, and Deb, Georgeann, and Jami for the public media response. We're inspired by you, and thank you for being here. And thanks for the sponsors of this, and Michael Levine too for helping to organize the report in the first place with all of us. So thank you. Go visit the website, see the report, and I hope to see you all soon.